Hey there, everybody. Steve the Amateur Historian. Thank you for joining me today out in my rustic, spacious backyard. And I have a case that I've been itching to do a video on for some time. Pretty much ever since I heard about the case, I knew at some point I was going to have to cover this because it's hardly the first murder case that's happened in Portland. It's hardly the first big murder case that's happened in Portland. It wasn't the first time that a woman was murdered in Portland, but it was one of the first instances of a really brutal, violent, almost passion-driven crime, the likes of which hadn't really been seen in the city of Portland before. Today's video is the 1885 murder of Emma Merlotin. Emma Merlotin was of French ancestry. She was born, according to her gravestone, in 1850, which is interesting because I saw reports that by 1885, she was reported as being in her late 20s. I know one newspaper said that she was 28, but she would have been 35 at the time. And speaking of her headstone, that is one of the elements of this case, only one, that has intrigued just about anybody who visits her gravesite. She's buried at Lone Fir Cemetery in Southeast Portland, and she was known as Emma Merlotin. That was the name that she was known by. Yet on her gravestone, it says her name is Anne, and then I'm guessing her middle name was probably pronounced Jeanne because she was of French ancestry. Could have been Jean, or at least if you altered it after coming to America, but it says Anne, Jeanne, possibly, Tingray Lacause. No Emma, no Merlotin. Now, it is known that Emma had a brother named Joseph Lacause, who was deeply involved in the settling of her estate after her death. The fact that he had the last name of Lacause leads me to believe that Lacause was Emma's maiden name, so she was probably born Anne Lacause. I've also seen her described as Anna Lacause, but her gravesite does say Anne, not Anna. And as far as the Tingray, well, there was a man by the name of C.G. Tingray who co-owned the property that Emma Merlotin lived at when she died, invariably the place where she was killed. So they shared that property together, and yet his name on her gravestone almost implies that they were married. However, there is no evidence that actually shows that they were honestly anything beyond co-property owners. So it's intriguing that that is the name that's on her headstone when she was known as Emma Merlotin. And it is, some people have taken that and reached the presumption, the inaccurate presumption, that Emma Merlotin was just a pseudonym she went by, and it really had no basis in reality. However, when Emma Merlotin was younger, she did marry a man by the name of Merlotin. Nobody seems to be able to find out what his first name was. He was just this Merlotin man, who she married when she was living in New York, on the opposite coast of Portland. And early 1870s, 1873, 1874, Merlotin apparently just abandoned Emma and just ran off, disappeared. Even by the time of her death, it was presumed that her prior husband, Mr. Merlotin, was probably dead by that point, because it seemed like nobody knew what happened to him all these years later. But she kept the Merlotin name for whatever reason, and ultimately found herself in Portland. So where the name Emma came from, that may have been a pseudonym. You know, Anna, Emma, Anne, Emma, they're kind of close. Maybe that was just a name she went under. And it would make sense that she might alter her name to a degree, or go by a name that wasn't necessarily 100% not biologically, but at least in terms of what she was named when she was born, not fully accurate to that, because she was a prostitute in Portland during the 1880s. She was what was described as a French courtesan. Courtesan meaning essentially she was a high-class hooker. Her clients that she saw were all presumably men of wealthy backgrounds. Most of her clients were well-known people in the community, which was certainly good for her because she was probably getting paid good money, but it also meant that a lot of people with a lot of influence that would maybe to some degree or another not want friends and family to know that they were seeing prostitutes on a regular basis, it would make her a liability to them. Now, why would I say that? Because during the early 1880s, prostitution, the world's oldest known profession, was actually considered a fairly respectable profession during that time in Portland. Women openly prostitutes. They didn't try to hide it. And Emma Merlotin lived in a fairly nice little cottage, if you will. They were referred to as cribs. I don't know if that's like an origin term for what we think of now when we think of someone's crib that they live in. But yes, she lived in a crib near the southwest corner of 3rd and Yamhill Street, right dead in the middle of downtown Portland. There's a Microsoft store there now, and Pioneer Place, the shopping mall in downtown's right across the street, right across Yamhill from where she used to be. So obviously, all these many years later, nothing looks the same as it did then, but that is where Emma Merlotin lived and presumably conducted much of her business out of. This area was known as the Tenderloin District at the time, and there was a lot of prostitution going on in that area. It was a focal area for that. And again, prostitutes, it was a more respectable business at the time. That was until 1881. A woman named Carrie Bradley ran a house of prostitution, if you will, actually on 3rd Avenue, reportedly between Taylor and Yamhill. So she was running her house out of the same block that Emma Merlotin was living at. Carrie Bradley also relocated to Oregon from the East Coast. There was some, there were some minor connections, but it seems at that point that's where the connections ended, because while Emma Merlotin was kind-hearted and generous and charitable, she literally was the hooker with a heart of gold. Carrie Bradley was crooked, and she had all sorts of various forms of petty crime going on out of her house, and the authorities knew that, and there was actually an investigation going on into what was going on at Carrie Bradley's place. And there was a gentleman by the name of Brown, I believe it was James Nelson Brown, who had recently relocated to the Portland area, and he hooked up with one of Carrie Bradley's girls, who reportedly ripped off a couple bucks from him. So he was angry about that, and he ended up agreeing to be a witness to this investigation that was going on into Carrie Bradley. So suddenly, Brown is the enemy. And as it seems, Carrie Bradley had some of her cronies lure Brown back to her place where he was killed. And it was this just chaotic mess of a story. Here, maybe this video I did about Carrie Bradley's murder can better line up the complications they had after they killed Brown. And it's hilarious, you have these criminals who are doing all sorts of crooked stuff out of their house on this block. And one of the most difficult things they have, the one thing they can't really seem to resolve easily, is how to get rid of the body. So their first idea, or I guess their primary idea, is they want to dig a hole. They're able to get down into that little kind of crawl space ground underneath the house, underneath Carrie Bradley's house. So she sends, her tough guys out there to start digging a grave to put this body in. But it's really rough, gritty, hard ground, and they're at it for like more than a day, and I don't even think they got a foot down. the backup plan is then to have Pete Sullivan and a couple of the other guys there. They've already buried the grave. Like, they made it just deep enough to bury him in, but it wasn't deep enough, so they have to go down under the house. And I mean, they're right in the middle of the city here. They have to go back under the house and, you know, dig him up and then stuff him into a trunk so that he can be removed to the house and brought out into public without suspicion. They took the body there and put it in the river, and again, it wasn't found for about a month. Because the idea is it's probably around October 29th, October 30th, and it's November 25th before the body's recovered. So eventually, Brown's body was recovered, and it was pretty quick with how, you know, chaotic the attack was. It was pretty obvious who was directly involved, and this caused a major shift in the attitude towards the prostitutes and what, you know, may have been going on behind closed doors there in the Tenderloin District, right along Southwest 3rd. So, processing from 1881, 1882, 83, 84, 1885, the attitude has changed. There was a lot more of a negative perspective of prostitution. There was a lot more negative perspective of what was going on in that area. There was a drastic increase in violent acts that occurred towards prostitutes in that area at the time. And with the attitude kind of changing, a lot of the people in the area and a lot of the police in the area didn't really care that much. They didn't really investigate these things that deeply. So there was suddenly, if you were a prostitute in that area, suddenly you weren't as safe as you may have been pre all the Carrie Bradley drama. Which brings us to December 22nd, 1885. It is approximately 10:15 p.m. Emma Merlotin presumably had a client visiting her, and one of her nearby neighbors, who was just described in newspapers as Miss Amelia, started hearing a commotion over there that she described as a struggle going on at her place. So she left her place and started to approach Emma Merlotin's crib. And by the time she got there, all had gone quiet. It appeared to be dark inside. She tried the door handle. The door was locked. So Miss Amelia, again as she was called, returned to her place, but then came back a couple of minutes later to try to check up on Emma again. With this short passage of time, just a couple of minutes by her account, she approached Emma Merlotin's crib, and now the door to the place was wide open. It's still pitch black inside. She entered the dark crib, fetched a lantern to light the place, and began searching around to see what was going on. She reached the bedroom, Emma Merlotin's bedroom, and there she discovered Emma Merlotin down, flat on the ground. She was lying on her left side. Her whole head had just been caved in by numerous attacks to the head by an axe or a hatchet of some kind. There were at least 12 discernible strikes that had been made to her head, and there was just a pool of blood flowing from her head as she laid there on the ground. Like, Miss Amelia had gotten there so quick after she had been killed that the pool of blood was still forming around her head. So clearly she was not wrong when she heard a struggle happening, and the fact that her door was wide open suggested whoever did this to Emma Merlotin did it and then quickly took off. So this was a whole other, you know, there had been assaults, there had been hostilities against prostitutions, but this wasn't just the first real brutal slaying of a prostitute in Portland. This was the first real murder of this type, at least that got headlines in Portland. So it was a big deal. Miss Amelia, shocked, fled the scene and ran to seek out the police to report what she had seen. And the police began, one of the first things they did was they began consistent surveillance on her crib, because again, even back then it was known, criminals who commit crimes and then in the moment get away with it, they do sometimes return to the crime scene. Or what if, whoever did it left something behind and had to go back and get it? So her house was monitored for a few days, and there were already some interesting stories coming out, stories that didn't appear to go anywhere, of possible suspects in the immediate, talking couple hours after Emma Merlotin was killed. There was one man who reportedly had stopped by another crib along 3rd Avenue and seemed to be panhandling, went to one of the cribs and asked for some money and was told no. And apparently this man was seen walking in the direction of Emma Merlotin's cottage, and he appeared to be pissed off because I guess he wasn't getting any money. And so it was kind of inferred, well, maybe this guy was going to ask Emma Merlotin for some money, and he's already angry that he's not getting anything. And then when she said no to him, even though Emma Merlotin was known to be a charitable person, she would have said no, and he would have gotten mad and gone into a frenzy and killed her. Problem with this was, would he have just randomly had a hatchet on him when he was doing this? Because he would have had to have a hatchet. The fact that whoever showed up had this hatchet with them means someone went to her place with the objective to kill her, as far as I'm concerned. That they came armed. And this hatchet, as far as I could see, was not recovered from the crime scene. So whoever did it, it seems, left with the murder weapon, or at least stashed it somewhere close by well enough that nobody ever found it. But anyway, it was also noted that, Emma Merlotin, who, was doing pretty well for herself financially, none of her items of value had been taken. So it was pretty quickly the police were able to kind of discern this was likely not a crime based on a robbery attempt, or a robbery attempt that had gone wrong, because nothing of real value was taken from the house. So if this guy was going to kill Emma Merlotin and then take some of her stuff, well, why didn't he? It didn't really make a lot of sense. This may have just been a sketchy transient looking for some extra cash. But that wasn't the only strange story that came from that night. There was another report that showed up in at least a couple newspapers, and it's almost like it was this urban legend. It definitely seemed like it was just some rumor that was getting spread around town in the aftermath of this wild, crazy homicide. But there were reports that very shortly after Emma Merlotin was killed, that there was a man who was apprehended on a boat in the Willamette, maybe trying to get into a boat and flee the area. And this man reportedly was just covered in blood. And the police arrested him and took him in. But there's nothing to the story beyond that. So it's one of those things. I was like, did this even actually happen? We don't know. It may have just been a rumor that was going around. And again, considering the hostilities that have been going on against prostitutes in Portland for some time by that point, and the fact that Emma Merlotin was a courtesan with these very wealthy clients, it was thought most likely that whoever did this was probably not even a client that did it because she wanted them to pay up and they didn't do it, because again, these were fairly wealthy men that she was seeing. But it was most likely that this is at least what they were going with. This seemed to be the most logical thing, was one of her clients that she was seeing was probably nervous about his seeing her getting out. Maybe they had an argument, maybe they had some issues with each other, maybe she passively or directly threatened to reveal what was going on to people, which would have a drastic effect on his reputation. Again, back in 1880, maybe this wasn't that big of a deal, but by 1885, there was this new, real negative connotation about prostitution, and that applied to the people who still were going to see prostitutes. So by 1885, your reputation was in a lot more trouble if it was found out you were going and seeing prostitutes than it would have been a few years earlier before all the Carrie Bradley drama. So that was definitely what they were working with, and there was this very interesting thing. Again, you go back, this is the 1880s, they have a lot of archaic investigation methods, and when authorities' backs were to the wall, there was a lot of sometimes crazy and bizarre things they tried to do in the hopes of getting some lead on their case. And there was a thing that was kind of going around that was known as octography, I believe is the term. If it's not, if I'm messing that up, I'll put the real word right here. But anyway, this was a practice that was created under the presumption that when someone died or was rendered unconscious, they would, much like a camera snapshot, they would capture whatever the last image was that they saw with their eyes before they died. So if Emma Merlotin was attacked and killed, possibly the last image that would be captured in her eyes would catch the reflection of the man who killed her. So authorities had her eyeballs removed. I don't remember if it was both, but at least one of her eyeballs was removed and placed in possession of a well-known cameraman who would try to get snapshots of her eyes to see if they captured a rendering of the man who killed her as he did it. So it was very bizarre late 1800s crime analysis, pseudo-scientific methods that they would go by to try to gauge an answer. And I mean, obviously this was not successful in actually determining who Emma Merlotin's killer was. But it's this very interesting kind of dark form of mystery investigation that they would utilize. Maybe the mystery can be solved by looking into the reflection of the eyeballs of the dead murder victim. It almost sounds like something out of a crazy old Sherlock Holmes story from way back then or something like that. So that was another thing that was unfortunately unsuccessful in helping Emma Merlotin's case. And there just wasn't a lot to go on, especially that far back in time when investigative methods were so much weaker than they are now. But they didn't even have the murder weapon as far as I could gather. I didn't find anything in any newspaper reports on the case that stated that the weapon was left behind in her crib or it was abandoned right outside the home. And that brings us to what was reportedly 3 days after Emma Merlotin is killed, which would have made it Christmas Day 1885. Law enforcement is still maintaining an eye on her crib to see if anything of interest occurs. And on this night, they note 3 gentlemen kind of walking around and prowling around the area, which already gets their attention. But they notice one of the men that's prowling around had discernible scratches on his face, scratches that had probably happened recently. And if you think back to Miss Amelia's story that there was a struggle that was heard before Emma Merlotin was killed, you can think maybe she fought and scratched at whoever killed her. So this guy with scratches on his face near the crime scene obviously got the authorities' attention, and they quickly apprehended the man, who identified himself as William Sandstrom. And they took William, or at least accompanied William Sandstrom, back to this cabin he was staying at. And they began searching around. And they discovered specifically some pantaloons, as was a much more common form of attire to be worn back then, and some shoes that both had a red substance on it that looked like blood. Sandstrom claimed it was paint, but analysis afterwards determined that this substance was in fact blood. I don't know if they were able to determine whether it was human blood or animal blood. They just were able to determine that it was blood. So that was a pretty damaging find, in addition to him loitering near the crime scene and the scratches on his face. But a second search of that property also revealed a necktie that had blood on it. And the coup de grace of the whole thing was, right outside of his cabin, authorities found a hatchet that also had blood on it. Sandstrom claimed this was chicken blood, which, in all fairness, that was a fairly common thing back then. A lot of people, for food and whatever, would end up slaughtering their own animals. So it was kind of common to have hatchets and things like that had animal blood on them. But still, there was all these items that had blood on them. So, were these signs that William Sandstrom was guilty? He claimed he got the scratches on his face by falling against a trunk. I don't know if that means, like, he fell against a tree and the bark on the trunk scratched his face, or if, like, it was like a trunk that you would open and store items in, because a lot of people had trunks back then. So, it's not really explained what kind of trunk this was, and either way, that story kind of sounded a little far-fetched. So was William Sandstrom guilty? Was he really just a dumb criminal who killed Emma Merlotin with this hatchet and then brought the hatchet back to his cabin and left it out in the open with the blood still on it to be found? Again, that sounds incredibly stupid. Maybe William Sandstrom was a stupid criminal. I don't know. So there was definitely reason to believe this guy was guilty. And what didn't help him was there were witnesses. After he became a suspect, there were multiple witnesses who said they saw William Sandstrom in the vicinity of Emma Merlotin's crib on the night she was killed. That being said, it was also a very common thing. You know, if you had a suspect, especially in a case such as this, it was very easy for the general populace in the area to become immediately convinced like that this was the guilty party, and they would do what they could to get this person convicted, even if all they had to go on was the police found a guy and there's a few instances that make him look guilty. This happened all the time. People would say all the time, "Oh yeah, I saw that guy near this place," because they would be convinced that this person was guilty. So here I am as a citizen doing my part to help you bust him. Yeah, I'll say he was outside Emma Merlotin's place right before she was killed. Hell yeah. That's not to say that these eyewitness accounts aren't reliable, but it's just they have to be taken with a certain grain of salt, with the understanding that it was very common for citizens to just come out and say, "Oh, hell yeah, this person was in that area," and then you find out later on that they were absolutely incorrect. Sandstrom himself claimed that around 10 o'clock, and again, Emma Merlotin was killed around 10:15, so around the time she was being killed, Sandstrom said he took a streetcar to the vicinity of 14th and Washington, which is several blocks from where Emma Merlotin lived, and he claimed he went to a saloon there, had a few drinks, caught the streetcar back to his cabin. I couldn't find if he had verification for this, if he had an alibi for this. Did people at the saloon say they saw him there? I couldn't find that definitive information. So it kind of hung in the air. Who do you believe? William Sandstrom and his claim of where he was at the time, or the fact that witnesses put him near the crime scene? And there he was, right back by the crime scene a few days later, and he's got these scratches. He has kind of a crappy story for where they came from. He was definitely a decent suspect, all things considered. Sorry, shook you up a little bit there. But while he was arrested for the crime, he was released just a few days later. He was released on December 29th, just a week after Emma was killed. He was released for a lack of evidence. That was all it really said in the paper. So maybe they found out all the blood they found was animal's blood. It was noted in one newspaper that the hatchet they did find at his property appeared to be very dull, and based on an examination of Emma Merlotin's wounds, it was felt that she was attacked with a very sharp, probably recently sharpened hatchet of some kind. So that created some doubt in people's mind, but ultimately Sandstrom was released for lack of evidence, and it doesn't seem like he was ever seriously pursued again as the possible suspect, or they just never found any more evidence on him. And that was really where the case went cold for a while. The most drama that popped up in the case was the battle over her estate. Again, this was a very well-to-do prostitute, and apparently her estate was worth about $4,250, which ain't a lot these days, but you think it was 1885. That was a lot of money back then. That was more than $100,000 that she just had to her name. And this was drawn out for a couple of years. It wasn't until 1888, spring of 1888, that finally it was deemed that her brother, Joseph Lacaze, was the sole heir to her estate. He was apparently the only known living relative, or the only known closest living relative to Emma Merlotin. Reportedly, both her parents were gone or their whereabouts were unknown. And again, they assumed her first husband, so-and-so Merlotin. There was at least one newspaper article that said it was assumed he was just dead. He abandoned her and he just disappeared, forgotten forever. It was really interesting. That was really the only exciting thing that was happening in the case for quite some time. This brings us to the next wrinkle, if you will, in the story, which actually connects to a whole other infamous crime that happened, not in Portland, but in Oregon. This was the case of Richard Marple and his mother, Emma Merlotin, who, back in the 1880s, I believe, 1886, 1887, Richard Marple helped his mother kill this man that she was seeing so that they could take her money. And this was in the small town of Lafayette, Oregon. I've been through there a few times. I visited the old schoolhouse there that's been turned into a bookstore that's reportedly haunted, and the infamously haunted Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery that I've also been to and actually has a connection to this case. So Richard Marple gets busted for this murder, and he's executed in Lafayette in 1887. So within 2 years of Emma Merlotin being killed. And when he was executed, his mother infamously put a curse on the town of Lafayette and said, "Your town will burn down 3 times." And apparently the town of Lafayette has more or less burned down twice since she made that claim. So maybe, hopefully not, there's another fire awaiting Lafayette's future. And Emma Merlotin, the mother who passed on this curse that appears to be coming true, she is reported to haunt the Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery. And one of the most sketchiest stories I've heard about this Pioneer Cemetery was that people claimed to get attacked by a woman there who would, you'd be there on the property and she would come up and scratch you down your back. I'm just glad we didn't visit there at nighttime. But I did visit and do a video on the Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery, knowing some of this sketchy history. So this is kind of an infamous, creepy, cursed, haunted story that happened in Lafayette, several miles from Portland. However, during the time that Richard Marple was in jail awaiting execution, he had a cellmate by the name of William Hess, who came out and stated that Marple admitted to killing a French woman in Portland sometime earlier. Of course, Emma Merlotin was a woman of French ancestry who lived in Portland. And apparently Marple claims that he was paid to do this. He was paid a good amount of money, maybe by a fairly well-to-do client of Emma Merlotin. But whatever the case, he said he was paid a fairly good amount of money to go there and kill her. He also claimed that he was part of a 4-person team that included, it was him and 2 others going into the house and killing Emma, and then another person on the outside as a lookout. Now again, this story has been altered to claim that this was specifically Emma Merlotin that Richard Marple was talking about, but it has to be said here that it's all is known is that Richard Marple admitted to killing a French woman in Portland. Now, obviously, Emma Merlotin fits into that quite nicely, but that does not mean for a definitive certainty that he was Emma Merlotin's killer. It's just, it makes him look like a possible suspect now based on the story he gave. That being said, nobody claimed to see multiple men in the vicinity of her home. There's nothing to verify this 4-person team aspect of things, which maybe they just did it and were sneaky enough and got away with it. But the fact that Mrs. Amelia came outside to check on the house, she didn't see a lookout in the area, of which apparently there was in Marple's case. And it just seems strange. Why would you need 3 men to go in and kill this one woman. That seems excessive, and it also seems like the more people you have involved, the more better you're setting yourself up to get caught or seen or to screw up. It's more people to talk. So this was a big story when this came out, and of course Richard Marple was executed, so he couldn't really be investigated further on the matter. But it definitely shined light on him. Was Richard Marple responsible for killing Emma Merlotin? It's in the guise of this story that Hess tells. You know, and again, this was his cellmate in jail, so maybe he was just telling this story to maybe hopefully get some leniency on his sentence or whatever. And of course, Emma Merlotin's murder was a well-known story by this time, so maybe this guy just kind of stitched together some details that kind of matched Emma Merlotin's case and then told the authorities, oh, Richard Marple, the guy that's now dead and can't defend himself, he said that he killed this French woman in Portland. I don't know what that means. So it's possible he could have been just being the proverbial jailhouse snitch who was hoping to get a little leniency for bringing this big piece of information to the authorities. So was Richard Marple responsible? Was he not? It's hard to say for certainty, but, you know, that brought the Emma Merlotin case back into the spotlight now almost 2 years after she was killed, at a time where her case was starting to fade and fade and fade. And this Tingray fellow who was co-owning the property with her, it doesn't seem... He was also of French ancestry, as she was. Which made sense. Back in that time, people from various different countries, when they relocated to Portland, you know, as immigrants, people of various countries often stayed with their own during that time. But it doesn't seem like he was ever considered as a possible suspect. He was a jeweler who actually owned his own store right there in the city. I found a bunch of old ads looking through newspaper articles under the name Tingray, and I found a lot of ads for his jewelry store. But he, you know, again, he co-owned the property with her, and he seemed to be very much, he was really pushing for her estate to get settled and for them to decide where her, you know, assets were going to go, so that he could, you know, sell off his piece of the property and wash his hands of the situation, but also probably get a decent chunk of money out of his half. So, you know, when somebody's like that in the aftermath, you know, they're really pushing to get it handled so they can get their hands on some money for the property, it casts at least a little bit of suspicion on them. You know, was he maybe pressuring Emma Merlotin to sell and she didn't want to do it? She had her perfect little crib right there in the Tenderloin District. Life was good for her. Maybe he wanted to get rid of that property and she just wouldn't do it, so he snapped and killed her, or had her killed. You know, maybe he's this supposedly fairly well-to-do man who paid off Richard Marple to kill her. Again, if he's even guilty. Again, there's not really any substantial evidence that I've been able to find or that has been put out to say that C.G. Tingray was a suspect, or that the police even really suspected him, but he was closely connected, and, you know, the desire to sell off some property and make some good cash is more than a strong enough motive for him to have done something drastic. So again, not really enough to say either way whether Tingray is a real viable suspect, although it is interesting. I'm very interested to know the circumstances that led to his... There goes my notes. It's my own notes trying to censor me. But I am very interested to know the circumstances, and it doesn't seem like anybody really knows why Tingray's name is on her gravestone, because it doesn't seem like they were married to each other. There's no verification that they were married to one another. That makes it more interesting, is how is this guy end up going from being a co-property owner, like maybe they were friends and whatnot, to him showing up on her headstone. It's just strange to me. But again, not really enough to go on to say this guy is a real serious suspect. But you got to consider a lot of people when you have an unsolved murder case. And after the Richard Marple drama, which kind of was there for a moment and then gone, and I think probably with the fact that it was coming seemingly from a jailhouse snitch, it seems like probably a lot of people didn't really think the story was that reliable. And again, you couldn't go after Richard Marple now. He's long gone. So the case kind of faded from memory again. It faded for years. The 1880s gave way to the 1890s. And then suddenly 1896 comes along and a possible new suspect out of nowhere. And this particular individual was named, now I'm going to try to say these names right because I think this is also a French individual. Antoine, I'm going with Favre because the guy's name is spelled like Brett Favre, but that's not really a lot to go on. But it's spelled just like his name, Favre. Antoine Favre, I'm guessing was his name. And this was a guy who was serving time in prison in Montreal, up in Canada, specifically for attempted murder of a woman. So apparently this guy had it in him to kill a woman. And he apparently made a confession to a gentleman by the name of Francis Moranville. I'm looking at my handwriting to make sure I wrote that right. Francis Moranville took a confession from Favre. And the reason that this came about was, again, it's 1896. It's been over a decade since Emma Merlotin has died and no resolution. So while Favre was in prison, he got into a fight and was stabbed. So I guess the prison doctor, whoever, told him, based on examining his injuries, that he did not have long to live, that he was going to die from his injuries. So, like a lot of people in that position, Favre decided to air all of his misdeeds out. I guess he was going to probably try to cleanse his soul before he went into the great light. And he told Moranville that during a brief he was only in Portland for 2 days. He said that while he was in Portland briefly, he killed a French woman while attempting to rob her. Now again, looking back on Emma Merlotin's case, it doesn't seem like robbery was a real viable motive because a lot of her expensive stuff was left behind. Maybe the guy intended on doing it and then maybe, realized they'd made a loud struggle. Maybe people in the area heard it and that they needed to split before other people showed up. Again, whoever did it ran out of her crib and missed encountering Miss Amelia by, possibly seconds. But that was Favre's story. So again, his claim was that he killed a French woman in Portland. So like Richard Marple, he didn't say specifically Emma Merlotin is the woman I killed, but it's a French woman in Portland, and it was during a brief stay. So it's like he was able to show up, do that, and then split town. And it's probable that nobody even knew he was there, so he wouldn't realistically come up as a possible suspect because authorities probably wouldn't even known he was there. So it's another situation where Emma Merlotin's name is not specifically referenced. We just know that he claimed to have killed a French woman in Portland years earlier. And the fact that this guy thought he was going to die leads me to believe that whether it was Emma Merlotin or not, that this guy was probably telling the truth. He wouldn't really have a reason to lie. I mean, if he didn't do this, he probably wouldn't say anything. He would just be like, oh, tell my family I love them or whatever. However, when you hear the manner in which Favre gave his story, it is more in the realm of possibility. His claim is that he comes to town briefly, he meets Emma Merlotin, she takes him back to her place to show him her jewelry, was his claim. Considering she was a prostitute and he was a guy passing through town, I get the feeling probably the main reason he would have ended up there would be to utilize her services, so to speak. And, he got to see him like, oh, she's actually got some good stuff here. So he claimed that he waited for her afterwards. He waited for her to leave her crib so that he could go in and steal her stuff and take off before she came back. However, when she did leave, she came back apparently relatively quickly because she caught him in the act of trying to steal her stuff. So his response to this situation was he beat her over the head and knocked her to the ground, trying to shut her up, knock her unconscious. And then out of the fear that when she came to, she would still identify him as the person who was trying to rob her, and now had committed an assault on her, he then decided to kill her. He also was reported to have had a massive collection of newspaper clippings, specifically about Emma Merlotten's murder. So that's always suspicious when somebody has this big collection of stuff in relation to a certain crime, especially one that they might have potentially been involved with. So maybe his story, how things went down, has credence. It still seems to me the manner in which Emma Merlotin was killed, which was, I hate to use this word, but revolutionary for that time in Portland. Most murders before then were quick. You know, somebody shot you, somebody stabbed you and went off. But this appeared to clearly be a crime of passion. This was he didn't just, stab her through the heart and leave. This individual proceeded to axe her repeatedly in the head to a point where there had to be no doubt in the aftermath that she was deceased. And based on his story, it seems like, he came to her house, she showed him some jewelry, and all of a sudden he thought, I could steal this stuff. So how does he magically end up with a hatchet that's used to kill her? Again, whoever did this, I think, did it premeditated. They showed up with the intent of killing her, and they brought this weapon with them. Where that weapon ended up, again, we don't know. So that's a little hitch in Favre's story. And again, just like Richard Marple, we don't have Emma Merlotten's name specifically referenced, just a French woman in Portland. And the last real information I was able to find related to this case before it just seems to have disappeared from the newspapers pretty much forever. Every so often I would find an article that would reference Merlotten's death, oftentimes misspelling her name, because these would be articles that were written 20, 30 years later, and they would just be reflecting back on unsolved murder cases in Portland. And I remember finding this article, and it was about, the infamous 1880s death of Emma Merlotin. And I was like, ooh, this sounds like a interesting story. I'm going to go investigate it. And then the moment I started, I was like, 1880s murder of Emma Merlotin. And there was a woman named Emma Merlotin who was killed in the 1880s. How much you want to bet it's the same case? They just screwed her name up. And of course, that ended up being what happened. But shortly after this Antoine Favre story came out, a fairly infamous local criminal, Bunko Kelly, as he was known, he was in prison. I believe he was put into prison shortly before this, so mid-1890s, on a murder conviction. And he told the authorities when he was in prison, hey, you let me out, I can find you Emma Merlotten's killer. Give me, a month, and I can find her killer. It sounds a lot like, this is a thing that gangsters did a lot when they finally got busted and were in prison. I know, or not even when they were necessarily in prison, but I know, like, a great example to compare to this was when Al Capone was in prison on his tax evasion case and Charles Lindbergh's baby went missing. He said, hey, you go a little easy on me and I can get my boys to go figure out what happened to Charles Lindbergh's baby. It's exact same concept. Bunko Kelly was trying to get a little leniency from the authorities by saying, oh, hey, I can use my resources and I can solve you this murder case that's lingered unsolved for over a decade now. And by Bunko Kelly's account, it's almost like the jailhouse snitch concept, except he wasn't in jail when he supposedly got this information. But he claims, it's a very far-fetched sounding story, but Bunko Kelly claims that a couple months after the murder, so it would have been early 1886, he met with this man whose name he didn't give authorities, because obviously if he would have, he wouldn't have anything to hold over them to try to get them to let him out. But he said a couple months after, he met with this man in San Francisco who opened up to him and admitted to having killed Emma Merlotin, and that this man hopped on a ship and went back to France. So apparently it was another Frenchman. So yeah, very, very far-fetched, very suspicious. He just happens to meet a guy in San Francisco a couple months after the murder, and this guy just tells him all these details, because apparently Bunko Kelly as a trustworthy face. And he said he met with this guy again in 1893. So, I don't know, maybe this guy was a past crony of his. And I didn't find any follow-up information really on that angle, just that Bunko Kelly offered his services. And it seems that police were probably, they were probably done with this crap, and they were probably like, yeah, I'm sure this is a true story, and I'm sure you have information, and I'm sure if we let you out of jail, you're not going to just split town and live on the lam, which was a lot easier to do back then. And yeah, it seemed like Kelly was just kind of, any case that was unsolved, he was just kind of throwing his services out there. He also claimed to have information about the murder of a guy named Thomas Kennelly, who was killed in 1886, not that long after Emma Merlotin. Another crime where there were definite possible suspects. I think there was another case of somebody who on their deathbed admitted to being involved in his murder. Much like in the case of Anton Favre, who thought, I'm on my deathbed, I might as well alleviate myself of my crooked past. And Thomas Kennelly was found amidst the ruins of the Villiard hotel or house. And these remains were really close. They were really close to Pioneer Courthouse. They would have probably been roughly where the Sandstrom rack is now, which is right across Pioneer Courthouse Square from there. Interestingly enough, only a few blocks from where Emma Merlotin was killed, but their deaths were separated by a decent span of time. But yeah, that was another big unsolved case, was Thomas Kennelly, who just, somebody stumbled onto his remains in the remains of an old abandoned building. So it seemed like any case that hadn't been solved, Kelly was just kind of throwing his services out there and just kind of, anything you need, governor, I'm going to give it to you. And that's probably why it never went anywhere. I don't think the authorities really took him seriously, but that was really the last thing I really ever found, at least in old newspapers on this case, was Bunko Kelly offering his services in what would have been September 1896. Almost 11 years after Emma Merlotin had been killed, and there was no resolution to her case. And, here we are, it's more than 125 years later, and there's really been no new suspects, no new angles, and it's a case that's so old it seems very far-fetched that we'll really ever know who was responsible for killing Emma Merlotin. I personally feel I do kind of lean towards and agree with the angle that was probably one of her clients who, again, possibly their motive may have been they were worried that their experience with a prostitute would get known and it would ruin their reputation. And so, under whatever circumstances that would have created, they killed Emma Merlotin to keep her from being able to tell anybody that they'd been seeing her. Again, the fact that it seems like it was such a passionate crime. This was a brutal, passionate crime. This was not just point your revolver at someone, boom, and that's it, which was the more common kind of, most murder cases was just somebody went into a saloon and boom, shot someone and they were dead. That was how a lot of, but this was, a crime of passion, as it seems. So, it could have been a customer who, for all the fears they had about being revealed, maybe had, on the flip side, a good rapport with Emma Merlotin and knew that they had to kill her, but also felt just horrible about it. And it was just this violent struggle that led to this violent, brutal killing. I kind of lean towards that as being, again, who knows for certain, but I really do lean towards that as probably at least being the best theory to go on. But again, we're probably never going to know for certain unless there's some written confession in someone's old papers somewhere, unless there's some real odd, unlikely piece of evidence that's still out there somehow, more than a century later. Hell, almost a century and a half after the fact. Unless there's something like that out there, or some story that's been passed down through a family lineage and some, someone from 4 or 5 generations later is going to come out and say it. It's unlikely the murder of Emma Merlotin, or Anne Lacaze, as it seems like she was born as, unlikely that it will ever be resolved, unfortunately. But it was one of the first great, brutal, violent murders that happened in the city of Portland, which gave it, you know, such it has such a rich history. She wasn't the only person that was killed in 1885. There's a lot of people getting killed during that time in Portland, but her murder case stands out above all the rest during that time for various reasons. And that is the story of the infamously unsolved murder of French courtesan Emma Merlotin. Came from France to America, managed to find a good life in Portland, and then, like is so easily possible, it was all taken away in the blink of an eye. So I want to thank you guys so much, as always, for joining me, retelling of this tragic, tragic story that is deep, deep-seated in early Portland history. And as always, I want to welcome you to like, share, subscribe, all those things. If you want to help my channel grow and you like what I'm doing, you like what I'm putting out. And if you want to help me even further, hit up my Patreon. If you want to help me out there, the link is in the description. I've already got a few patrons over there, and I appreciate everything you do to help support me in the way that you have. You're all great. I love all you, unless you don't like my content, in which case, well, that ain't my problem. So again, one more time, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, for, you know, the twistedness of the whole thing, if twistedness is a word. Anyway, till next time, guys, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.